Hi folks, in this video I am going to go over the scenario where we are using GitHub as a way to back up our code and also to share our code. So let's orient ourselves here. On the left hand side we have our VS Code with the project we created when we were using Git as a single user. On the top right here is going to be the web browser where we'll log into our github.com website. And in the bottom right is the developer A's machine's file system. So let's go to GitHub and let's create a new repository. I'll be creating it under our organization. You can create it under your personal account or organization, or if you're working in a team, the team's account. So we could name it anything. It doesn't need to match our folder name, but for simplicity, we're just going to keep that the same. We'll make this public so everyone can view it. We're not going to initialize it because we already have a repository we want to push. So let's create this. And here we have it, a new repository under our organization. And if we were to kind of expand out this GitHub, there's some basic instructions on how to get started. We already have an existing repository, so we're going to try to push it. So they only give command line commands, how to do this, examples on how to do this in command line, which we won't go over now. We will do something similar in a future video. We're going to do all the same thing, but with VS Code. So the first thing we gotta do is tell our Git that there's a new origin. And origin is kind of like a remote source for your code. And in this case, our origin is GitHub. So this is the URL of our GitHub repository. So we can copy this, and we're going to add that origin to our repo locally. So let's do that. Our file system more or less will not change, but this is to remind you that this is what is on our developer A's machine's hard drive. And everything we're doing here, what we just did, was on GitHub. So just keep that in mind. We weren't doing anything on our developer A's local machine. Okay, so let's add our repository. In our Git tab here, here's our remote. We're going to add a remote. We're going to give it a repository URL. So that's our URL. And we're going to give it a name. Here is the instructions is to call it origin, which is very common. Origin is a very common name to use if you only have one remote, which is, most of the time you only have one remote. There are scenarios where you might have more, but for this class, we'll just probably only have one. Okay, So once we do that, in our configuration, the origin has been created. Again, we could easily type this out in our .git config file, but using VS Code, we accomplish the same thing. So if you ever typo anything, you can just modify it here. Okay, and now if we take a look at our graph, we don't see origin on here at all. But once we publish our branch, which in essence is pushing our repository to the GitHub servers, we'll have replicated our local code onto the GitHub machines. Okay, so let's do the push now. And you see that origin is added, and it's also tracking that our local master branch should coincide with the origin's master branch. So again, all this is happening in the .git config, and if we delete this one folder, everything about repository is gone. But since we've pushed it, it's all on GitHub server. So when I refresh this, we should see our code. So here's our code, our file one, our git ignore, which ignores all the files we don't want to keep. And then remember, we did a .keep file. So this keeps this folder. Without that file, this folder would not be tracked. But because we have a file, Git's gonna track this folder as well. So we have the structure of the project, but any extraneous artifacts are not kept within the repository. So now, if we were ever to delete this .git folder, we're safe because our code is, our repository with all these branches is already saved to the GitHub machine. So now I'm just going to simulate what happens if our developer A's machine crashes. So imagine if this is crashed and we no longer have this repository anymore. So if that's the case and we want to get it back, we'll need to clone down. Git's the terminology used in Git is cloning. It's more or less what you would consider downloading. We're going to download this repository to our desktop. You could also download just the files, but we're going to download it as a Git repository. So let's see if we can. Okay, here we go. Clone a repository. That's what we want. So I guess the previous time it was in a folder, so it didn't think it needed to clone anything down because you're working in the folder. It would be nice if it's part of the menu, but I don't see it. So yeah, maybe there's a way to do it. I just don't know how, and this is fine. So we'll clone the repository, we'll give it the URL, and it's going to ask us when we clone it or download it, where do we want this new repository? So we are going to put it onto developer A's machine. And because this folder we're assuming is gone, it'll be a brand new machine. We're going to download it a fresh folder to developer A's like recovered machine, but has either recovered or new that doesn't no longer have our old code. So we'll do this, and it'll download it as a new folder. And I guess it's still requiring us to open it. So once we do that, everything should look back to normal. Open this. Sorry. I'm trying to get to my Git graph. And here we'll see that it our history is preserved. The one thing you should notice is if we look at the Git config in our newly cloned repository, we no longer have the user information. So we'll need to set that up. We can either type it in or do the command, run the terminal commands git config user.name, which we won't do here. So that more or less runs through the scenario where we're using GitHub to kind of store our code. The last little bit of tidbits I want to go over is because we actually created the repository on a local machine. We created the repository on a local machine and then pushed to GitHub. We can actually go the opposite, where we create the repository from GitHub and then download to our developer machine. So we're going to run through that scenario. So let's do a new repository. I'm going to say git demo created on GitHub. So we create it on GitHub first, and we're going to initialize it with a README. We'll just do a README. So here we'll create it on GitHub, and then we're going to clone it onto our developer machine. So let's close this window, and we should be able to clone a repository. So we'll clone it, give it the new URL, go back to developer A's machine, and here, oh, that's nice, that'll do it. So here, that's the README that GitHub created for us. It's a blank, oh, not this one, but this one. It's a blank repository. Again, it has its own config file. So now we can start editing it and then pushing out changes back to GitHub if we wanted to. Okay, so again, the default, it could be master or main. That's very conventional nowadays. So if you created it from GitHub, the convention, the default branch they'll give you is main. And then they provide you with a README. Okay, so that's using GitHub to create the repository and then cloning it down to developer A's machine. Okay, so the one other last bit of information is we've been cloning it with HTTP. If you wanted to use an SSH key, you gotta set it up, which I have not. This comes down, I think, more or less to preference. I do see enough times, enough articles about using HTTPS where it doesn't seem to me like one is overly safer than the other, but I'm not a security expert, so I could be wrong. So you would add your SSH key here, and then the public key, and then you'll have your private key on developer A's machine, and that's how GitHub will trust your developer A's machine. So that's how that would work. If you want to use HTTPS, I highly recommend using a personal access token. In developer settings, so you can create one, and then once you can each one I won't do that here, but once you create it, it will essentially give you a password, a hash password, and you can use it. You can use it as a regular password. So the benefit of that is each machine you go to, you can generate one, and so you won't use the password to log into your account, and instead each of these machines will have these personal access tokens. That's more or less a password, but it's easily revoked because you can delete them, and then yeah, those passwords will no longer be usable. So you have the option of using SSH or HTTPS, and that's why there's these multiple options here. Those two are common. I think GitHub has their own kind of a command line tool, but we won't go into that. Okay, so that's all I intended to talk about, how to use GitHub as a way to back up and share your code. I guess by sharing, I should show you what I mean by sharing, because once it's on GitHub, people can actually see your files. And yeah, you don't have to email them your code, but you can email them a link. And we'll go over how to use some of these linking tools to be explicit about your sharing your code in a later video. Okay, so thanks for watching, and I hope that gives you an understanding of how GitHub can be used to kind of back up and share your code.